The night sky above Kyushu had never sounded like this before. At 2:38 in the morning on June 16, 1944, the deep, rolling thunder of engines poured down from an altitude no Japanese pilot had ever fought at. It was not one plane, it was not 10, it was 75 silver machines, cruising in loose formation across the darkness above the Imperial iron and steel works at Yawata. Air raid sirens screamed across the coke ovens, searchlights clawed at the black sky. And for the first time since Jimmy Doolittle's raiders had struck Tokyo more than 2 years earlier, American bombs began to fall on the Japanese home islands. But something was different this time. These were not the medium bombers Japan had prepared for. These were not aircraft any officer in the Imperial General Staff had ever seen with his own eyes. From the ground, the anti-aircraft crews could barely make out the shapes above them. Gunners cranked their Type 99 88mm cannons to maximum elevation. They fired, and they watched their shells burst uselessly in the freezing air thousands of feet below the enemy formation. Old men in fire warden armbands, standing on rooftops in the districts around the steel works, tilted their heads back and heard the drone but could not see the source. Sound was the size of a city. The bombers themselves were invisible. Somewhere inside one of those bombers, a young sergeant from Pittsburgh named Morris Kramer looked down through the plexiglass at the flashes of Japanese flak. An Associated Press correspondent named Thoban Wyant sat behind him, scribbling notes for a story that would be printed the next morning in newspapers across America. Kramer was 21 years old. He had left his mother's house in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood less than a year earlier. He was now dropping incendiary loads on a country most of his high school classmates could not have found on a map. Only 47 of the 75 bombers actually dropped their loads near the target. Only one bomb, a single bomb out of hundreds, struck the intended factory. 7 aircraft were lost that night. By almost any conventional measure, the raid was a disaster. Conventional measures did not apply anymore, because what mattered was not the accuracy of the bombs. What mattered was that they had come at all. They had crossed the Himalayas. They had staged out of remote airfields around Chengdu, airfields that tens of thousands of Chinese peasants had carved out of the countryside using nothing more than hand tools and shoulder poles. Every drop of fuel had been flown in over the mountains in a supply operation the American pilots called the Hump, a route that killed more American airmen than combat did. And in the end, they had reached the industrial heart of Japan. The war had entered a new dimension. The Japanese empire simply did not know it yet. In Washington, D.C., inside the still unfinished corridors of the Pentagon, a 57-year-old general with a heavy jaw and tired eyes read the incoming reports before dawn. General Henry Harley Arnold, Chief of the United States Army Air Forces, had personally staked his career on this program. 2 months earlier, on the 4th of April 1944, he had convinced the Joint Chiefs of Staff to create an entirely new command, the 20th Air Force, reporting directly to him in Washington. No theater commander in the Pacific would touch these bombers. They belonged to Arnold alone. He had bet everything on a single machine. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress had cost the United States $3 billion to develop. Figure was not a rounding error. It was $1 billion more than the entire cost of the Manhattan Project, the top-secret program that was at that very moment racing to build the world's first atomic bomb. $3 billion for an airplane. It was and remains the single largest research and development expenditure of the Second World War, larger even than the weapons that ended it. And on the night of June 15th, that airplane had finally reached Japan. The man who had commanded the raid was Brigadier General Kenneth Wolfe, the leader of Exig Bomber Command. Wolfe was a career officer, a former engineering executive, the kind of methodical, careful commander who ran the numbers before he ran the mission. Numbers were the problem. Fuel had to be flown across the Himalayas, drum by precious drum, on the backs of transport aircraft. Every single gallon that reached Chengdu had cost the American war machine a fortune. Some estimates suggested that 7 gallons of fuel had to be burned by transport aircraft simply to deliver 1 gallon to a B-29 waiting on a Chinese runway. And Wolfe could not build the stockpile fast enough for the next raid. Arnold, watching from Washington, was already losing patience. Wolfe would be relieved of command within weeks, but 6,000 miles away, in a quiet suburb west of Tokyo, a very different kind of man was reading a very different report. His name was Tatsuo Hasegawa. He was 28 years old. Had graduated from the Imperial University of Tokyo just 5 years earlier. And yet, at that improbable age, slim, meticulous, soft-spoken, he had already been made the chief designer of the Ki-94 project at the Tachikawa Aircraft Company. On his drafting table lay the blueprints of an aircraft that did not yet exist. It was called the Ki-94, and it was Japan's answer to the B-29. Hasegawa did not need the news from Yawata to tell him what was coming. He had known for 2 years. Here is the truth that shatters the popular myth of Japanese ignorance. Japan was not caught off guard by the B-29. Japanese intelligence had been tracking American very long-range bomber development since 1942. The Technical Division of Imperial Army Headquarters, working alongside engineers at the Nakajima Aircraft Company, had begun a formal research program in that same year, 1942, to the one component that would define the coming air war: the exhaust-driven turbo supercharger. The mechanical lung that would allow an engine to breathe in the freezing thin atmosphere of the stratosphere. They knew. They had always known. The problem was never knowledge. The problem was matter. A turbo supercharger is not a matter of drawings on paper. It is a matter of physical elements: tungsten, cobalt, nickel, molybdenum, heat-resistant alloys that can survive the moment when searing exhaust gas at 900 degrees Celsius screams into a turbine spinning at more than 20,000 revolutions per minute. But without those metals, the turbine blades warp, they melt. They shatter in flight. A pilot at 30,000 feet loses power, then oxygen, then consciousness, in that order, in less than a minute. Japan had almost none of those metals. An American submarine campaign was at that very moment systematically choking the maritime lifelines connecting the Japanese home islands to the resource-rich territories of the conquered empire. Bulk cargo ships loaded with tungsten from Malaya, with cobalt from the Dutch East Indies, with nickel from occupied Burma, were being torpedoed and sunk faster than they could be replaced. Some months, the American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant tonnage at 4 times the rate the Japanese shipyards could build replacement hulls. The materials were rotting on the ocean floor. Hasegawa understood this with a precision that must have felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. He could design the Ki-94, he could sketch its lines. He could calculate its performance curves, but he could not build it. But in numbers that mattered, not in time. Meanwhile, at the very same moment, engineers at Boeing's Wichita plant in Kansas and at 3 other massive production facilities scattered across the American heartland, Boeing's Renton plant in Washington, Bell Aircraft's factory in Marietta, Georgia and Martin's plant in Omaha, Nebraska, were rolling B-29 airframes off automated assembly lines at a combined rate that would eventually produce more than 3,900 aircraft. Prototypes, not experimental models, combat-ready bombers delivered as standard disposable inventory. 3,900 of the most complex aircraft ever built by human hands. Hasegawa's factory could barely produce 300 fighters a month. And the number was falling. If the disparity had ended there, it would have been catastrophic enough. But there was another problem, a harder problem. A problem sitting inside the cockpits of the very airplanes Japan was still able to build. Pilots. By June of 1944, the experienced Japanese aviators who had ravaged American airfields at Pearl Harbor, who had swept the skies over Malaya and the Philippines and the Solomons, were mostly dead. They had died in the meat grinder of Guadalcanal. They had died at Midway. They had died in the endless, grinding attrition of the South Pacific. The Imperial Navy had lost the core of its carrier air groups during the Marianas Turkey shoot that same month, when American Hellcat fighters had slaughtered nearly 400 Japanese aircraft in a single afternoon. The Imperial Army had lost most of its veterans in the New Guinea campaign, in the endless bloody jungle fighting that had produced almost no strategic result. The men who now climbed into the cockpits over Kyushu that August were in many cases boys. One of them was Sergeant Shigeo Nobe. He was 22 years old. He was assigned to the 4th Sentai of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service. His aircraft was the Kawasaki Ki-45 Toyu, a twin-engine heavy fighter whose name meant Dragon Slayer. In the back seat sat his gunner, Sergeant Denzo Takagi. A Ki-45 had been designed originally as a long-range escort fighter, but by the summer of 1944 it was being pressed into service in a role its designers had never intended. Bomber interception at extreme altitude, a role for which its engines were marginal, its climb rate was inadequate, and its armament was, against a target as massive as the B-29, almost embarrassingly light. Nobi was not a legend, he was not an ace, he had not shot down famous Allied fighters. He was a young non-commissioned officer, doing what young non-commissioned officers do in every army, in every war. He was flying the mission he was ordered to fly, but on the 20th of August 1944, Shigeo Nobe would do something no one had ordered him to do. Second raid on Yawata came at midday. 61 B-29s from Chinese airfields droned toward Kyushu in the summer haze. This time the Japanese fighter defense was ready. More than 100 interceptors climbed to meet them. 43 Hayabusas, Ka-44 Shokis, 40 Victorious, twin-engined heavy, and slow to climb. The interceptors clawed for altitude, and they found again that their machine guns simply could not do the job. Superfortress was too big, too fast, too heavily built. 12.7mm rounds from the Ki-45's nose cannons bounced off the aluminum skin. Even direct hits to the wings barely slowed the American formations. B-29's remote-controlled defensive turrets, still not yet fully understood by the Japanese, laid down a lattice of return fire that hammered the attackers. 12 B-29s went down that day. It was one of the worst American losses of the entire China-based campaign. Most of those B-29s did not fall to guns. One of them fell because a 22-year-old sergeant made a choice. Transcripts of Japanese radio communications from that day survive in fragments. What is documented is that Nobi transmitted his intention, told his ground controller, and he told the men flying beside him what he was about to do. Then he flew his Ki-45 directly into the right wing of a B-29 named Gertrude C. The B-29 he chose was serial number 42-6334. It belonged to the 468th Bomb Group, 794th Bomb Squadron, based at Kharagpur, India. Its pilot was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Clinkscales, an experienced airman. Aboard the aircraft were 13 American crewmen. Nobe struck the right wing at cruising speed. His Ki-45 disintegrated on impact. Sergeant Nobe and Sergeant Takagi died instantly, incinerated inside their own machine. The Ki-45 tore through Gertrude C's right wing spar and ruptured her fuel tanks. A B-29 exploded into a fireball and spiraled toward the Kyushu countryside. All 13 Americans aboard were killed. That should have been the end of it. It was not. The B-29s over Yawata that day were flying in a tight defensive formation, almost wingtip to wingtip, to concentrate their gunners' overlapping fields of fire. The debris from Nobe's collision, the twisted metal and burning fragments of both aircraft sprayed sideways at 300 miles an hour into another Superfortress flying just behind and to the left. Her name was Calamity Sue, serial number 42-6368, also from the 468th Bomb Group. Her pilot was Captain Arnold Stouffer. Aboard were 12 men. The debris destroyed her horizontal stabilizer. Calamity Sue lost control instantly and began to fall. 9 of her crew died in the crash. 3 managed to bail out, drifted down over northern Kyushu, and were captured. They would spend the rest of the war in Japanese prison camps. They were the lucky ones. 22 American airmen died in the span of perhaps 4 seconds, because a Japanese sergeant chose to trade his life for theirs. This was the 20th of August, 1944. This was the first deliberate ramming attack against a B-29 in the history of aerial warfare. And it would not be the last. But here is what is most important about that afternoon. Nobe made his choice. He was not following an order. There was no ramming doctrine yet in the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service. There was no formal special attack unit for the B-29. That would come later. And the 20th of August, Sergeant Shigeo Nobi was an individual man in an individual aircraft, making an individual decision because he had understood in his own way what the engineers at Tachikawa were beginning to understand in theirs. Machine guns were not going to be enough. Fighters were not going to be enough. Numbers were not going to be enough. Something had to break. The immediate consequence of the disastrous fuel logistics and the escalating losses fell on Kenneth Wolfe. General Arnold, watching from Washington, had already lost patience with the pace of the China-based campaign. Wolfe was relieved of command of ex-Bomber Command. Brigadier General Laverne Saunders took over on an interim basis. Then in late August, Arnold made his real choice. He sent a man named Curtis LeMay to take permanent command. LeMay was 37 years old, subtly unsentimental, had run bomber operations over Nazi Germany with a coldness that his own crews found unnerving. He had personally flown the lead aircraft on the disastrous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid of August 1943, in which 60 American bombers had been shot down in a single afternoon because he believed that a commander who would not fly the missions he ordered had no moral standing to order them. He would spend the autumn of 1944 in China trying, and largely failing, to make Operation Matterhorn produce results. He was learning, he was watching, he was measuring. And by January of 1945 he would be somewhere else entirely. Somewhere much closer to Tokyo. Meanwhile, back at the Tachikawa Aircraft Company, Tatsuo Hasegawa read the classified after-action reports from the Yawata raids and understood that the game had changed permanently. Ki 94 was still on paper, the Ki 87 at Nakajima was still a mock-up. Ki 91, Kawasaki's desperate attempt to build a Japanese answer to the B-29 itself, was under construction at a facility in Gifu Prefecture and would eventually reach only 60% completion before American bombs destroyed the factory. Every project was late, every project was under-resourced. Every project was hostage to materials that could not be smuggled past American submarines. The reports from the wreckage sites were beginning to filter back through military channels. Fragments of B-29s were being recovered from crash sites across the empire. Twisted aluminum panels, charred sections of wing, pieces of turrets, pieces of engines, all of it being crated, tagged and shipped by rail to a compound in the western suburbs of Tokyo. A place called the Tachikawa Army Air Arsenal, not the Tachikawa Aircraft Company, where Hasegawa worked on his blueprints. A different Tachikawa, a military research institute, a place where the Imperial Japanese Army took apart the things it captured. And what the engineers there were about to find when they began to systematically dissect the wreckage of Boeing's $3 billion Phantom would not merely shock them. It would tell them in cold, unforgiving detail that the war they were fighting was not the war they thought they were fighting. It was something else, something they had never seen before. Something that no amount of courage, no amount of skill, no amount of individual sacrifice could possibly answer. They were about to open the machine, and inside the machine they were about to find the future. The wreckage arrived by rail. Long freight cars, their sides topped in dark canvas, rolled slowly westward out of Tokyo through the late summer heat of 1944. Inside those cars, packed in wooden crates and secured with military straps, lay the twisted, blackened remains of American bombers that had fallen across the Japanese Empire. Aluminum panels curled by fire, sections of fuselage still bearing the painted names and pin-up girls of their crews. Fragments of engine cowlings the size of dining room tables. Instrument panels, some with the glass still intact, still showing needles frozen at the last airspeed the aircraft had ever recorded. And thousands of smaller pieces, sorted, tagged and catalogued with the patience of a nation that understood, even now, that engineering was destiny. Trains came to a halt inside a walled compound in the western suburbs. The Tachikawa Army Air Arsenal, a military research institute, a place where men in white cotton coats and cotton gloves waited under long fluorescent lights, holding clipboards and calipers, and the quiet, terrible curiosity of professionals about to open something they had never seen before. It is important to understand who these men were. They were not the aircraft designers of the Nakajima or Mitsubishi factories. They were not the celebrated pilots of the Sentai. They were engineers of the technical division of Imperial Army Headquarters. Physicists and metallurgists on loan from the Imperial University of Tokyo. Electrical specialists trained in the finest technical schools of pre-war Japan. Some of them had studied in Germany in the 1920s. Some had worked briefly in American laboratories before the war. They spoke each other's languages fluently in the private tongue of the international scientific community that the war had suddenly and violently severed. Men in their 30s and 40s, most of them wearing round wire-rimmed glasses and the plain khaki uniforms of the Imperial Army. These were the finest scientific minds Japan had. They had spent their careers assuming that Japanese engineering, though sometimes lagging in scale, was fully competitive in intellectual quality with anything the West could produce. They had designed the Zero after all. They had built the Yamato, the largest battleship the world had ever seen. They believed, with the confidence of educated men who had never yet been humbled, that they were about to examine another airplane. They were wrong. The first section they opened was the cockpit assembly. What remained of it? The pressurized crew compartment of a B-29 was at that time one of the most closely guarded engineering achievements in the American arsenal. Japanese engineers had heard rumors of it. They had never actually seen one. Now they saw one, and what they saw did not look like an airplane cockpit. It looked like the interior of a small, self-contained scientific laboratory. Reinforced bulkheads, rubberized sealing gaskets of a synthetic compound Japan simply could not manufacture. Riveting so precisely countersunk that a fingertip run across the seams could not detect where one aluminum panel ended and the next began. Every joint machined to a tolerance measured not in millimeters but in fractions of millimeters. At 30,000 feet, the outside atmosphere is minus 50 degrees Celsius. The air is so thin that an unprotected human being loses consciousness within seconds and dies within minutes. Every previous bomber in every previous war had accepted this as a limit. Crews wore heated leather suits, breathed through oxygen masks, and endured the freezing agony as part of the job. B-29 refused the limit. Inside its pressurized fuselage, American crewmen flew at 30,000 feet in shirt sleeves. They breathed normal cabin air at a normal pressure, roughly equivalent to 8,000 feet of altitude. They drank coffee, they ate sandwiches, they talked to one another without oxygen masks pressed against their faces. They played cards during the long transits over the Pacific. The nose gunner and the aircraft commander could pass a thermos back and forth without either of them wearing gloves. Japanese engineers stared at this system for a long time. It was not that they did not understand it, they understood it perfectly. The mathematics of pressurization was well known, the physics was elementary. A concept had been discussed in scientific papers on both sides of the Pacific for more than a decade. Broke them was the manufacturing. To seal a pressure vessel of that size against the aerodynamic flexing of a bomber in combat maneuvers required synthetic rubber compounds that Japan did not produce. It required rivets that Japan could not countersink to that tolerance. It required an entire supply chain of aluminum alloys, sealants, gaskets and fasteners, all delivered to a single factory floor on schedule in enormous volume, month after month. Japan had none of it. Japan could not build it, and Japan, at the current pace of American submarine warfare, would never be able to build it. The engineers made careful notes. They photographed the compartment from multiple angles. They cut small samples of the sealing material and sent them to the university laboratories for chemical analysis. They moved on to the next section. It got worse. The next section was the defensive armament. Every combat bomber in the history of aerial warfare up to that moment had defended itself with the same fundamental architecture. The gunner sat behind a window. He held a machine gun. Aimed the machine gun with his own eyes and his own hands. He led the target using the instinct of experience. When he pulled the trigger, the tracers went where his arms and shoulders sent them. The B-29 did not work that way. When the Japanese technicians opened the sealed housings that controlled the bomber's defensive turrets, they found something they had never seen inside any aircraft anywhere in the world. General Electric analog fire control computers, networks of servos and gyroscopes and precision electrical relays. centralized nervous system tethered to remote gun positions along the length of the fuselage that automatically calculated airspeed, gravity drop, target lead, and parallax correction in real time. A gunner sitting at a central sighting station could aim guns at the front, back, top, and belly of the aircraft simultaneously. The computer did the mathematics, the computer did the aiming. The computer decided where the bullets should go. If the aircraft was hit and the primary gunner was killed, control automatically transferred to another sighting station elsewhere in the fuselage. The system had redundancy built into the redundancy, and these components were carried to the physics laboratories of the Imperial University of Tokyo. The professors examining them did not need translation. Understood immediately, analog computers were not an alien concept in 1944. Japanese scientists had built simple analog calculating machines for naval fire control and academic research. The mathematics of the differential equations involved was familiar. Engineering principles were textbook. That was exactly what devastated them. Because building even one working analog fire control computer in the Japanese scientific ecosystem of 1944 was a laboratory project. It required a small team of the best physicists in the country working for weeks, hand calibrating every component, testing every relay by hand in an environmentally controlled laboratory setting. It was a delicate scientific instrument. The Americans had figured out how to mass produce it. By the tens of thousands, they were bolting laboratory-grade electronics into combat aircraft. They were sending those aircraft into hostile skies over Japan. They were fully expecting many of those aircraft to be shot down. And they were not slowing production. They were accelerating it. The Americans were treating scientific instruments as expendable ammunition. Japanese engineers, standing in the fluorescent light of the Tachikawa arsenal, staring at the dismantled circuits laid out across their workbenches, understood at that moment what the war had become. It had become mathematics, and Japan was on the wrong side of the equation. While these discoveries were being made in the laboratories, the war outside continued to accelerate. On the 1st of November 1944, a single American aircraft appeared over Tokyo at 32,000 feet. It was a reconnaissance variant of the B-29, designated F-13, flying unarmed and alone. Its mission was photographic. In a single flight, that one aircraft returned to its base in the Marianas with more than 7,000 aerial photographs of the Tokyo region. Those photographs would be used to plan the destruction of the city. Japanese defense scrambled. Fighter groups launched from airfields all across the Kanto plain. A Ki-44 Shokis of the 47th Sentai, purpose-built as high-altitude interceptors, clawed for altitude in the freezing thin air. They could not reach it. The F-13 flew serenely above them, at a height where their engines simply could not develop the power to catch it. It made its runs. It took its photographs. It turned south and disappeared into the Pacific. Not a single round was fired at it in effective range. It was the day, for many Japanese officers, when the truth stopped being an intellectual argument and became a physical fact. The sky above their capital city was no longer sovereign Japanese territory. It belonged at that altitude to the enemy. 3 weeks later, on the 24th of November, 111 B-29s of the newly deployed XE-1 Bomber Command lifted off from Isley Field on the recently captured island of Saipan. The target was the Nakajima aircraft engine plant at Musashino in the western suburbs of Tokyo. Commander was Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, a thoughtful professorial officer who believed in the doctrine of daylight precision bombing. The results were again poor. Weather over the target was terrible. The bombers scattered. Only 24 of them dropped their loads anywhere near the primary target. But the deeper meaning was unmistakable. American air power had now established its permanent presence over the Japanese home islands. It was no longer coming from distant China. It was coming from an island group less than 1,500 miles from Tokyo. It would keep coming every week, every month, until it was finished. The Japanese population, watching those silver contrails cross the sky above the Imperial Palace, understood something that the propaganda broadcasts on Radio Tokyo would not admit. The war was no longer somewhere else. Back inside the Tachikawa Army Air Arsenal, the engineers had moved on to the engines. They knew, of course, that the B-29 was powered by 4 radial engines. Every combat aircraft in the world was powered by radial or inline engines. There was nothing novel about the concept. What the engineers wanted to understand was the specific engineering execution. Engines were the Wright R3000 350 duplex Cyclone. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows of 9, each engine developing 2200 horsepower at maximum output. They were, at that moment, the most powerful piston engines ever installed in a production aircraft in the history of aviation. And when the Japanese propulsion experts began to disassemble them, they discovered something that changed everything. R3350 was defective, not slightly defective, dangerously, catastrophically, lethally defective. The problem was thermodynamic. The rear row of 9 cylinders was packed too tightly behind the front row. In the freezing thin atmosphere of high altitude, where the bombers were designed to operate, the airflow over the rear cylinders was severely obstructed. The rear cylinders chronically overheated. They warped. They cracked. They swallowed their own exhaust valves. That alone would have been a serious flaw in any engine. But there was worse. To save weight, the American designers at Wright had chosen to cast the crankcases of the R3000 350 out of magnesium. Magnesium is roughly 1/3 lighter than aluminum. It is a wonderful material for reducing dead weight in an aircraft engine. It has one particular property, however, that the Japanese metallurgists recognized immediately with the ice-cold recognition of professionals who had been trained on the chemistry. Magnesium burns not the way ordinary metal burns. Magnesium, once ignited, burns like a thermite flare with a blinding white light at a temperature that can exceed 3000 degrees Fahrenheit. It cannot be extinguished by water. It cannot be extinguished by conventional foam. Once a magnesium fire begins in an aircraft engine, the fire will burn until the magnesium is completely consumed, or until it burns through the aluminum wing spar of the aircraft itself, at which point the wing comes off and the airplane falls out of the sky. The wreckage lying on the workbenches at Tachikawa bore the unmistakable evidence of exactly this kind of failure. Warped exhaust valves, melted cylinder heads, cowlings scarred by the characteristic burn patterns of a magnesium fire that had reached 3000 degrees before the aircraft came apart in mid-air. In some cases, the recovered engine sections showed clearly that the wing spar had been severed by the fire before any Japanese interceptor had gotten close enough to shoot. Japanese engineers, hunched over these ruined engines, understood the implication with a clarity that must have felt for a brief moment like hope. A B-29 had a fatal flaw, not a small flaw, a structural, mechanical, thermodynamic flaw at the very heart of its propulsion system. The most sophisticated bomber ever built was in fact an aircraft that routinely destroyed itself in flight. American aircrews were burning to death, not from Japanese anti-aircraft fire, not from Japanese interceptors, but from the very engines that were supposed to keep them alive. Some estimates from post-war American records indicate that the R3000 350 killed more B-29 crewmen through mechanical failure than the Japanese military ever managed to kill in combat. This was the vulnerability the Empire had been searching for. Intelligence officers took the news back to Tokyo. Interceptor squadrons across Japan were briefed. Pilots were instructed to abandon the standard doctrine of side attack passes. Instead, they were to make aggressive head-on firing runs at the engine cowlings of incoming B-29s. The objective was no longer to shoot down the aircraft with volume of fire. It was to place a single well-aimed round into the rear cylinders. Trigger the magnesium fire, let the bomber destroy itself. The tactic worked on several occasions. Warrant Officer Sadamitsu Kimura, a night fighter pilot flying a Ki-45 Toryu against a B-29 formation in the darkness above Yawata, executed the maneuver perfectly. He climbed from below. He closed to within 20 to 30 meters, an almost suicidal distance, using the searchlights on the ground to illuminate his target. Fired a short controlled burst into the port side engines. He would later describe the enemy bomber, framed in the searchlight beams, as looking like a great whale suspended in the ocean, and confessed that he was astounded by its size. A B-29 was named Limber Dragon, serial number 42-6230. She belonged to the 468th Bomb Group. She went down in flames. Limber Dragon was the first B-29 ever shot down over the Japanese home islands. Warrant Officer Kimura would be celebrated for the kill. His name would enter the honor rolls of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service. And yet, even in the moment of that triumph, the deeper truth was inescapable. Limber Dragon had been a single aircraft in a formation of dozens. The American factories in Wichita and Seattle were at that very moment rolling out replacement bombers at a rate that made a single kill, no matter how skillfully executed, functionally irrelevant. The Americans had built a flawed machine, and they had built it in numbers so overwhelming that the flaws did not matter. If a B-29's engine failed after 20 hours of combat flight, the Americans did not halt production to redesign the engine. They shipped tens of thousands of replacement engines across the Pacific Ocean and bolted them onto the grounded airframes on the tarmac. If a B-29 crew burned to death in an accidental engine fire on takeoff, the Americans trained new crews in Kansas and Nebraska and sent them out to fly. If entire aircraft were lost, entire aircraft were replaced. The Americans had absorbed the death of their own men as an acceptable cost of the strategic timeline. There was nothing Japanese engineering could do to change the equation. This is the moment when the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service made a decision that has haunted its history ever since. If the machines could not defeat the machines, then the men would. On the 7th of November 1944, the officer commanding the 10th Hiko Shidan, the air division responsible for the defense of the Tokyo region, issued a formal order. Ramming attacks against B-29s were no longer to be treated as isolated acts of individual pilots. They were now a matter of official doctrine. Specialized ramming units would be formed. Aircraft would be modified for the mission. Pilots would be trained specifically to fly their own machines into American bombers at high altitude. The lead unit chosen for the mission was the 244th Hiko Sentai, a fighter group based at Chofu Airfield on the western edge of Tokyo. Its commander at that time was Captain Takashi Fujita. Fujita organized the ramming flights under a name drawn from an ancient samurai code. I called them the Hagakure-tai. The name came from a 17th century warrior manual whose most famous line reads, "The way of the samurai is found in death." The men who volunteered for the Hagakure-tai flew stripped-down versions of the Kawasaki Ki-61 Hen fighter. Armament was removed. The armor plating was removed. Even the machine guns were sometimes removed. Everything that added weight was cut away, so that the fighter could reach the altitude of the American bombers with enough energy remaining to make one attack. The first pilot chosen to lead a Hagakure-tai flight was First Lieutenant Toru Shinomiya. It should be said clearly, these men were not kamikaze. The word kamikaze was not used inside the Japanese military. These were called special attack pilots, and the essential difference from the naval kamikaze was that the Hagakure-tai pilots were expected, if possible, to survive. They were instructed to ram, then to bail out if they could. Some of them did survive. Some of them rammed multiple B-29s in successive missions, parachuting to safety, receiving a new fighter, and going up again the next day. There are documented cases of a single Japanese pilot ramming 3 or 4 separate American bombers in the course of a single winter, walking each time from the wreckage of his fighter and reporting back for duty. Most of them died. Later in the war, command of the 244th Sentai passed to a man named Teruhiko Kobayashi. He was 24 years old. He was one of the youngest fighter group commanders in the entire Imperial Japanese Army Air Service. Under his leadership, the 244th became the most feared B-29 interception unit in Japan. Pilots would ram and ram and ram again until either their bodies gave out or the war ended. Kobayashi himself was said by his own men to have personally led ramming flights from the front, rather than sending his subordinates while he remained on the ground. He survived the war. He would die in a peacetime aviation accident in 1957 at the age of 37. the same time, in the 4th Sentai based on Kyushu, a different kind of pilot was becoming a legend. His name was Captain Isamu Kashidi. He flew the twin-engine Ki-45 Toryu, the same aircraft type that Sergeant Nobe had flown into Gertrude C on that August afternoon. Kashide did not need to ram. He mastered the head-on cannon pass against the R3000 350 engines with such precision that he became the most successful B-29 killer in the entire Ki-45 program. He would survive the war and live quietly into the 1970s in the small city of Sasebo, and rarely spoke publicly about what he had done. Japanese air defense in the winter of 1944 was not a story of technological victory. It was a story of individual courage stretched to the absolute limit of human endurance in a war that could no longer be won by courage alone. And even as those men flew, even as those engineers worked, the Empire was already trying, in the desperate final months, to build something that could genuinely compete. The Nakajima Ki-87 was the most advanced high-altitude interceptor Japan attempted. It had been under design at Nakajima since July of 1943, well before the B-29 raids began, as part of the earlier turbo supercharger research program. Its prototype was completed in February of 1945. It flew for the first time in April of 1945. Completed exactly 5 test flights. Its retractable landing gear malfunctioned so severely that all 5 flights were made with the gear locked down. A single prototype never entered service. The Tachikawa Ki-94, designed by Tatsuo Hasegawa himself, went through 2 entirely different designs. Ki-94I, an exotic twin-boom pusher-puller configuration, was rejected by the Army Technical Division as too complex. Ki-94-2, a more conventional design, was under construction when the war ended. Completed prototype never flew. The Nakajima to J5N Tenrai, a Navy twin-engine interceptor, made its first flight on the 13th of July 1944. Only 6 aircraft were built. The program was cancelled before it could see combat. Kawasaki Ki-91, Japan's own attempt to build a long-range heavy bomber comparable to the B-29 itself, was under construction at a facility in Gifu Prefecture when American bombs destroyed the factory in February of 1945. The prototype had reached 60% completion. It was never finished. Every project was late. Every project was under-resourced. Every project was hostage to materials that could not be smuggled past the American submarines, strangling the maritime lifelines of the Empire. And every project, in the end, produced nothing. By the beginning of 1945, the Japanese defensive strategy had collapsed into a single grim mathematics. The B-29 formations were flying at 30,000 feet. The Japanese interceptors could barely reach 25,000. The available fighters lacked the turbo-supercharged engines to fight at altitude. Available anti-aircraft guns could not throw shells high enough to threaten the bombers. The available radar network could not track the American formations with enough precision to vector interceptors into effective firing positions. And still the bombers came, more of them every month. From bases the Americans had captured, flying missions the Americans had refined. Guided by radar the Americans had perfected, defended by fire control computers the Americans had industrialized. The Japanese engineers at the Tachikawa arsenal continued their work. They wrote their reports. They circulated their analyses to the Ministry of War. The reports were carefully classified. Most of them never left the small circle of senior officers who needed to see them. To circulate the full truth widely would have destroyed civilian morale beyond any hope of repair. The truth was that Japan had already lost, not on the beaches of the Pacific, not in the sky over Kyushu, not in any single battle or campaign that could still be reversed by better tactics or braver men. Japan had lost inside the factories, and there was no defense against a factory. Outside the walled compound at Tachikawa, the winter of 1944 turned toward the spring of 1945. B-29 formations grew larger. The precision daylight campaign insisted upon by Brigadier General Haywood Hansell continued to produce disappointing results. Weather over Japan was atrocious. The jet stream at 30,000 feet, a river of freezing wind that no American pilot had ever encountered before, threw bombs miles off target. Something was going to have to change. In the third week of January 1945, General Arnold made the decision. Hansel was relieved of command of XE-1 Bomber Command. His replacement was Major General Curtis LeMay, the same LeMay who had failed to make Operation Matterhorn work in China. Same LeMay who had spent the autumn watching, measuring, learning. He flew to Guam, he took command, and within weeks he would issue an order that no one at the Tachikawa arsenal and no one anywhere else in the Empire was prepared to hear. He would order the B-29s to abandon the stratosphere. He would order them to come in low, he would order them to come in at night. He would order them to strip out their guns, and he would order them to burn Japan to the ground. Curtis LeMay arrived on Guam on the 20th of January 1945. He was 38 years old. He carried a cigar in the corner of his mouth almost constantly. He rarely smiled. His subordinates and his superiors and the correspondents who wrote about him all remarked on the same quality. There was no visible fear in the man. There was no visible sentiment. There was only the arithmetic of the mission and the willingness to do whatever the arithmetic required. I took command of XM Bomber Command. He inherited a force of hundreds of B-29 Superfortresses, each of them worth its weight in gold, each of them carrying 11 American boys, each of them flying missions against Japan that were not producing the results Washington demanded. The problem was the sky itself. At 30,000 feet over the Japanese home islands, the American bombers had encountered a phenomenon that no one in the United States Army Air Forces had ever seen before. River of wind, a jet stream screaming from west to east at speeds sometimes exceeding 200 miles per hour. Bombs dropped into that wind did not fall on their targets. They fell miles away. Sometimes they fell into the sea. A precision daylight campaign that Haywood Hansel had believed in, and that the entire pre-war doctrine of American strategic bombing had been built upon, was failing. LeMay watched the numbers for 6 weeks. He watched the mission reports. He watched the bomb damage assessments. He watched his crews take off and get shot at and come home with nothing to show for it. He watched the R-3000 350 engines burn on takeoff, killing men before they had even reached the target. He watched $3 billion of American engineering achieve very little against a nation that would not surrender. Then he made the decision. The decision was heresy. He ordered his B-29 crews to strip the aircraft down. Take out the defensive guns, take out most of the ammunition, take out the armor plating, free up every pound of weight for one purpose only. Load the bomb bays with M69 incendiary clusters. The M69 was a small canister filled with a gelled gasoline compound. A palm, essentially. When dropped in clusters over a city, the small canisters would scatter, ignite on impact, and burn through the wooden and paper construction of Japanese urban housing with a ferocity that no high-explosive bomb had ever matched. Each M69 weighed only 6 pounds, but a single B-29, freed of its guns and its armor, could carry more than 1,000 of them. The truly heretical part of the order was not the bombs. It was the altitude. LeMay ordered his crews to come in at 5,000 feet. 5,000, not 30,000, not 25,000. 5,000 feet, low enough that Japanese anti-aircraft fire could reach them easily. Low enough that a single well-placed shell could bring down an aircraft. And he ordered them to come in at night. There was no precedent for this. B-29 had been designed, from the very first sketch on Boeing's drafting tables, to fly high. Its pressurized cabin, its remote-controlled turrets, central fire control computers, its analog electronics, its turbo-supercharged engines, every single billion-dollar innovation that had shocked the Japanese engineers at the Tachikawa arsenal had been designed for one purpose: to let the bomber fight and win at the top of the sky. LeMay was throwing all of it away. He was going to fly the most advanced bomber in the world as if it were a 1918 vintage biplane, at treetop altitude, in the middle of the night over the largest city on Earth. His crews were told the plan in briefing rooms across the Marianas on the 9th of March, 1945. Some of them thought they were being sent to die. Some of them wrote what they believed were their last letters home. One of them, a young captain, later recalled that when the target and the altitude were displayed on the briefing map, The room went completely silent. Then the aircraft took off. 334 B-29s launched from Saipan, Tinian and Guam that afternoon. They flew north across the Pacific through the twilight and into the darkness. They flew low over the ocean, engines throttled back to conserve fuel, crews sitting quietly in the red glow of their instrument panels, listening to the drone of the R-3350s that they now hoped, more than anything, would simply keep running. They crossed the coast of Honshu just before midnight. 279 of them reached the target. The target was Tokyo. What happened over Tokyo in the early hours of the 10th of March 1945 has no comparison in the history of aerial warfare. B-29s came in wave after wave, low, slow and steady, releasing their M69 clusters over the densely packed wooden neighborhoods of the Shitamachi district. The incendiaries scattered, they ignited, they started thousands of small fires that within minutes joined into larger fires. Within an hour, those fires had merged into a single, enormous conflagration that generated its own weather. Firestorm. The temperature at ground level reached 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind pulled inward toward the flames at hurricane speeds. Canals boiled, steel bridges glowed, people who fled into the water of the Sumida River were boiled alive. The updraft from the fire was so violent that B-29s flying at 5,000 feet were tossed upward hundreds of feet by rising columns of superheated air, some of them arriving back at their bases with the black stain of Tokyo's ashes still visible on their aluminum undersides. At dawn, 41 square kilometers of Tokyo were gone. Approximately 100,000 civilians were dead. More than 1 million were homeless. In a single night, in a single raid, more human beings had died than would die at Hiroshima 5 months later. American losses were 14 aircraft, 14 out of 334. Heresy had worked, and here is the terrible, cold irony that the Japanese engineers at the Tachikawa arsenal would spend the rest of their lives thinking about. Every single piece of American technology that had shocked them, that had convinced them the war was lost, that had made them stare in disbelief at the wreckage on their workbenches, was now completely irrelevant. Pressurized cabin, not needed at 5,000 feet. The remote-controlled turrets, removed. The General Electric analog fire control computers, removed. The turbo superchargers on the R-3350 engines, barely relevant at low altitude. The central fire control system that had represented in the Japanese analysis the pinnacle of American industrial dominance. Left on the ground, the Americans had proven something the engineers had not at first understood. They had not won because they built a perfect machine. They had won because they built a machine so overwhelming that they could throw away its defining features mid-war and still burn the enemy's cities to the ground. Flexibility was the weapon, adaptability was the weapon. The willingness to abandon $3 billion of engineering because the mission required it was the weapon. Curtis LeMay would order the same tactic against 56 more Japanese cities in the months that followed. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, city after city, night after night, burned to the ground with incendiary bombs delivered from aircraft that had been designed to fly above the reach of any defense. July of 1945, LeMay's crews were running out of Japanese cities large enough to be worth firebombing. He was reduced in the final weeks to attacking small provincial towns almost at random, working from a target list ranked by size. But even LeMay was not the final chapter. Yes, in the summer of 1945, 2 B-29s took off from a base on the island of Tinian carrying weapons that had been developed in the deepest secrecy of the American war effort. Weapons that the Japanese engineers at Tachikawa did not know existed. Weapons that no engineer in any nation outside of a very small circle in the United States and Britain knew existed. These 2 B-29s did not belong to LeMay's regular force. They belonged to a specially trained and utterly isolated unit, the 509th Composite Group, commanded by a colonel named Paul Tibbets. Tibbets had been chosen for the mission in the autumn of 1944. Had spent the next 10 months training his crews at a remote airfield at Wendover, Utah, on the far edge of the Great Salt Lake, in conditions of such extreme secrecy that his own airmen did not know what they were training to deliver. The 6th of August 1945, at 8:15 in the morning, a B-29 named Enola Gay, commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets and named for his mother, dropped a single bomb over the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, on the 9th of August, a B-29 named Boxcar, commanded by Major Charles Sweeney, dropped a second bomb over the city of Nagasaki. The weapon each bomber carried had cost the United States roughly $2 billion to develop, in a program known as the Manhattan Project, whose existence had been concealed from almost everyone in the American government itself. Vice President Harry Truman had not been briefed on the project during Roosevelt's lifetime at all. Only after Roosevelt's sudden death on the 12th of April 1945, when Truman was hastily sworn in as president, did Secretary of War Henry Stimson quietly mention its existence to him. Full briefing, delivered by Stimson and General Leslie Groves, did not come until the 25th of April, 13 days later. Japanese engineers at the Tachikawa Arsenal, who had been trained in nuclear physics at the Imperial University of Tokyo, understood the theoretical possibility of an atomic weapon. Some of them had even worked on Japan's own small, chronically underfunded nuclear research program. But they had never imagined, in their most pessimistic assessments of American industrial capability, that the United States could actually build such a weapon in wartime. The Americans had. They had done it while simultaneously building 40,000 aircraft a year, while simultaneously fielding 16 million men in uniform, while simultaneously fighting a global war on two fronts, while simultaneously feeding half of the Allied world. The B-29, the machine that had already broken Japan's back with conventional and incendiary bombs, was the delivery vehicle for a weapon that had been kept secret from Japan by an industrial civilization so vast that it could hide the Manhattan Project inside itself, and no one on the outside had noticed. The 15th of August, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast on Japanese radio for the first time in the history of the modern imperial line. He announced Japan's surrender. He referred, in the language of his official rescript, to a new and most cruel bomb. The war was over. The engineers at the Tachikawa Arsenal packed up their laboratories. Some of them burned their most sensitive reports before American occupation forces could arrive. Others quietly filed the documents away, believing correctly that the knowledge they contained would matter again someday. Tatsuo Hasegawa, the designer of the Ki-94 that had never flown, went home to his family. Captain Isamu Kashide, the greatest B-29 killer of the Ki-45 program, survived the war. Major Teruhiko Kobayashi, the 24-year-old commander of the 244th Sentai, whose men had rammed American bombers with stripped-down Ki-61 Heians, also survived. So did many, though not all, of the engineers who had opened the Boeing $3 billion Phantom in the winter of 1944 and stared in the fluorescent light at the industrial autopsy of their own defeat. And 2 years later, in a place none of them had expected, the story would come back around. The 3rd of August 1947, at an air show held at Tushino Airfield outside Moscow to celebrate Soviet Aviation Day, 3 enormous 4-engined bombers appeared over the parade grounds in tight formation. The Western military observers in the reviewing stands looked up, squinted, looked at one another. Then someone said what they were all thinking. "Those are B-29s. They were not. They were Tupolev Tu-4s. Soviet-built copies of the B-29, so identical in every dimension that when they first appeared, many observers assumed they were captured American aircraft that had been repainted with Soviet markings. The story behind them had begun in the summer of 1944, at the very same moment the engineers at Tachikawa were beginning their autopsy. 3 American B-29s, damaged by combat or by mechanical failure over Japan, had diverted to Soviet Far East airfields near Vladivostok rather than attempt to reach their home bases. First was Ramp Tramp, serial number 42-6256 of the 462nd Bomb Group, which landed on the 29th of July. Second was General H. Arnold Special 42-6365, which arrived on the 11th of November. Third was Ding Hao 42-6358, which landed on the 21st of November. Soviet Union at that time was not at war with Japan. The neutrality pact between Moscow and Tokyo obligated the Soviets to intern any American aircraft that reached their territory. They did exactly that. The American crews were, after some diplomatic delay, quietly repatriated through Iran in a slow overland journey that took months. Aircraft were not returned. American demands for their return were ignored. 3 intact B-29s were flown one at a time to the Tupolev Design Bureau in Moscow. Joseph Stalin himself gave the order. The B-29 was to be reverse-engineered in full and reproduced as a Soviet aircraft. The engineer chosen to do it was Andrei Nikolaevich Tupolev. He was 56 years old. He was one of the most respected aircraft designers in the Soviet Union. Had spent time in the Gulag during the great purges of the 1930s and had continued designing aircraft from inside prison in a special design bureau known as a Sharashka before Stalin restored him to his post when the war made his talents indispensable. When Tupolev received his instructions, he made the natural suggestion. The B-29 was a superb aircraft, but Soviet engineering could improve on it. Tupolev proposed a number of modifications. Stalin's response, according to the account that has survived in Soviet aviation histories, was cold and short. Do not improve it, copy it exactly. Tupolev did as he was told. His engineers dismantled one of the 3 B-29s down to its last rivet, cataloguing more than 100,000 individual parts. They kept a second one intact as a reference model. Flew the third for training. They copied everything, including the American measurement system, which forced Soviet factories to retool from metric to inches for this single project. They copied certain manufacturing imperfections that had no functional purpose because Stalin had said to change nothing. The Soviet aviation industry retooled entire factories to produce a bomber to American specifications. A result was the Tu-4. When it appeared over Tushino airfield in 1947, the Western world understood in that moment that the strategic balance of the coming decades had been quietly transformed. The Soviet Union now had a heavy bomber capable of reaching most of the industrial cities of Europe. And within a few years, the Soviet Union would also have an atomic bomb to put inside it. First successful nuclear test came in August of 1949. The Cold War had, in effect, begun. More than 800 Tu-4 bombers were eventually built. And this is the final terrible irony that the Japanese engineers of Tachikawa never got to see written in the history books, though many of them lived long enough to read it. They had studied the B-29 more carefully than almost anyone outside of Boeing itself. They had understood its pressurized cabin, its fire control computers, its magnesium castings, its riveting tolerances. They had produced reports so detailed that a modern historian can still trace the individual bolts on individual turrets across their surviving technical documents. They had never been able to use any of it. The knowledge had died in their laboratories. The industrial base that would have been needed to translate the knowledge into aircraft did not exist in Japan, and could not be built while American submarines were sinking the ships that would have supplied it. The engineers had understood the future, but they had been unable to reach it. The country that reached it was not the country that had studied it. It was the country that, by pure geographic accident, had inherited 3 intact aircraft from crews trying to save their own lives. It was the country that had never fought over Japan at all. It was the country whose leader had said, in 3 short words, "Do not improve it." The Soviet Union built the future the Japanese had opened. And then a strange thing happened over the decades that followed. Japan, having lost the industrial war of the 1940s, was rebuilt under American occupation. Engineers of the Tachikawa arsenal, the survivors of Nakajima and Mitsubishi and Kawasaki, the physicists of the Imperial University of Tokyo, all of them were still alive. They were still trained. They still knew what they had seen when they had opened the Boeing $3 billion Phantom in the winter of 1944. And they remembered the flush riveting. They remembered the modular wiring harnesses. They remembered the tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. They remembered the American willingness to mass-produce laboratory instruments and treat them as expendable inventory. They remembered every single lesson that the wreckage on their workbenches had taught them. Over the next 25 years, those lessons became the foundation of a new Japanese economy. Shinkansen bullet train, which opened for service in 1964, 1 week before the Tokyo Olympics. A rise of Toyota, whose manufacturing methods would eventually transform global industry under the name of the Toyota Production System, and whose post-war engineering leadership included, among many others, that same Tatsuo Hasegawa, the young Ki-94 designer, who would go on to lead the development of the first Toyota Corolla. A rise of Sony, whose consumer electronics would flood every American home, whose founder Masaru Ibuka had been a wartime electronics engineer working on Navy heat-seeking weapons and radar. The YS-11, Japan's first post-war commercial airliner, designed in part by former military aircraft engineers, some of whom had drafted the never-built Ki-94 and the never-built Ki-91. Country that had been buried by American industrial mathematics in 1945 spent the next quarter century learning to speak that mathematics fluently. The engineers at the Tachikawa arsenal, standing in the fluorescent light in the winter of 1944, had believed they were reading the autopsy of their own defeat. They were reading it, but they were also reading, without knowing it, the blueprint of everything Japan would become. The B-29 had come to break them. In the end, it also taught them how to rebuild.